At long last, the UK government has finally suspended arms sales to Israel. The civil servants have reportedly begun indicating this when responding to export applications, with the newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, writing this. One individual involved in arms exports to Israel who was seeking permission received a notice in response that stated, "Suspended pending policy review." This suspension is happening while the government conducts a wider policy review on the dangers of selling arms to Israel, which will see Foreign Secretary David Lammy make an ultimate decision. And it's important to note there is no fixed date set for the completion of that review, but it could mean we see exports begin again at a later date. When asked to confirm whether the government had suspended all arms export licenses for Israel, a Department for Business and Trade spokesperson said this. It is vital that we uphold both our domestic and international legal obligations when it comes to arms exports. We are reviewing the advice available and will come to a considered decision. The department also insisted that their policy in regards to Israel has not changed and added this. We continue to review export license applications on a case-by-case basis against the strategic export licensing criteria. It is vital that we uphold both our domestic and international legal obligations when it comes to arms exports. We are reviewing the advice regarding exports to Israel and no decision has been made. This is a fascinating story for me because you've had in the last several weeks, of course, the end of the previous suspension of funding to UNRWA. The UK has now renewed its funding to UNRWA. The US is isolated in not having that funding. And of course, you had the UK more recently saying that they would respect the decisions of the ICJ, who are expected to give out arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. The UK is now saying we have no problem with that. They ended a legal challenge to that, which was co-signed with the Germans. It was really being pushed by the Americans. That's now gone. So surprisingly big, and I think positive steps being made by Labour with regards to Gaza, Israel, Palestine. But this, in terms of ending arms exports or suspending arms exports, even on the sly, even on a go slow, is really interesting. Mike, has Starmer and the new Labour government surprised you with its response to the ongoing conflict in Gaza?
In some ways they have, but in other ways they haven't, right? So the way in which I'm surprised is that Starmer's approach and Labour's approach at the moment creates clear water between them and the US. The UK and the US's foreign policy has been so wedded to one another. So when the US kind of jump, we say how high, right? That's kind of how it's operated. What's happening now is, in this moment, during one of the biggest crimes of our age, the UK are actually in many ways deviating from the US's approach, which is just unequivocally backing Israel no matter what. I think the UK are kind of taking a step back. So in that way, I am surprised. But in other ways, I'm not surprised, right? Because what we saw at the general election was Labour punished at the ballot box for its position on Gaza, right? So Labour, going into the election, had a very regressive view on this issue, right? And, they dismissed pro-Palestine protesters. They kind of framed them as extremists and as people who just kind of were isolated in British politics and weren't electorally that relevant. And what happened is we saw big losses. We saw Tang and Debonair lose her seat. We saw Jess Phillips almost lose her seat. We saw Wes Streeting almost lose his seat. So kind of really big hitters came within a whisker of losing their seats or did lose their seat, right? John Ashworth, who is probably still crying on Twitter at this moment in time, he lost his seat too, right? So it was momentous. It was a big issue going into the election. So I think for Labour, going down the path of Israel's right to defend itself, and we're not going to look at arms bans and all of that, that would have been costly, right? The pressure would have continued to ramp up, and if you continue to hold that position going into a future election, you're likely to be punished for that position, or you're likely to be punished by elections that happen in the kind of upcoming year or so. So I do think for Labour, electorally, there was a decision to be made in terms of pivoting to a more progressive position on Gaza. Now, look, this is big news, right? And I do think that this should be celebrated by those of us who've been on the left, who are raising concerns about, Israel's war crimes and Israel's ongoing genocide, unfortunately, and its kind of ongoing war and terror on the people of Gaza. This is a win for us, right? This is, in many ways, our protests have kind of forced this position. In many ways, because we've made this issue so electorally important, and Labour losing votes because of this issue, we've kind of forced their hand. So in some ways, I do feel proud of so many of us who took to the streets and protesting. Like, protest matters, it works, and it's why we should defend the right to protest. But then I also do think that Labour in many ways are doing the bare minimum, right? So these are things that are really important. Again, this is a big win for us. But, you know, last week or maybe the week before that, I think, kind of Lamy backtracked on recognising Palestine as a kind of as an independent state. I do think that's really important, right? So I do think that's important because the idea that we can kind of leave it to some kind of peace process is difficult when Netanyahu has quite unequivocally and clearly said that he does not want to recognize a Palestinian state. So, in doing so prior to some kind of peace process, we are actually in many ways providing a level of support for the Palestinian people. And I think they need that. So, beyond just kind of these kind of discrete arms kind of bans and these things, again, great stuff. We need to kind of positionally, I think, as a country, get behind the Palestinian people and support them against the plight and the ongoing plight they are suffering at the hands of Israel. So far, some good steps made by Labour, and that should be celebrated, but they still have several things they could do. I think sanctions as well would be another kind of useful step. But yeah, so far, some good steps in the right direction.
I think that's right. I would say that recognizing a state of Palestine, I think you've got 4 things there. They've done 3 of them. If they'd done all 4, my jaw would have dropped, frankly. And I have to agree, that has happened because of political pressure, right? This is a huge vulnerability for Labour moving forward. And there's a very simple political cost benefit here, right? You've lost John Ashworth, who was a very senior Labour figure. You almost lost Streeting and Jess Phillips. If both those guys had gone, by the way, they would be recognizing the state of Palestine, right? Or if Starmer's majority was 5,000 or 6,000 smaller, because these are really significant things. You know, Starmer's performance in his own seat, he's not going to lose the seat. Of course he's not. Well, he could do, but it's highly unlikely. Starmer's performance in his own seat was abysmal. So they know they have to get on top of this.